Hi, this is Sable Schultz, Director of Transgender Services at the Center on Colfax, here again with our fourth panel presentation today for the 2021 Queer Author Expo here at the Center on Colfax. We are talking about DIY and self-publishing for queer authors with Addison-Herron-Wheeler, who is co-publisher and editor-in-chief of Outfront magazine, staff writer at High Times, and managing editor at New Noise. Addison is a self-published author of Wicked Woman, Women in Metal from 1960 to Now, and DIY published author of a short collection entitled Respirator. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for this. This one is going to be great. The other one I did today was a little more off the cuff because I was filling in for someone else, but for this one I'm like, okay, this is my topic, so this will be great. So pretty much just what you said. Thank you for the great intro. I work with New Noise, which is a metal, punk, indie rock kind of magazine. I work for High Times. I am co-owner of Outfront. This is Outfront's latest Pride issue. If you haven't grabbed it yet, it's great.
We have some here at the center.
Yes, outside right now at the event, as well as always at the center. And then here is Wicked Woman, my self-published book, and Respirator, which is, it's still DIY published, but I actually had a publisher, and I'll explain the difference. So yeah, I think to start out, I kind of just wanted to go over like just a brief overview of sort of, formulating your idea and figuring out what you want to write about, but obviously this will mostly focus on the publishing aspect. So I think it just kind of depends on what you want to write about. So you could either, if you're doing something more like Wicked Woman, which is going to be nonfiction, you're going to want to start doing a lot of research. And if you're self-publishing, you don't really have anyone sort of directing you, holding your hand, telling you to do it this way or that. So it's kind of on you to just start researching, taking notes, kind of taking the initiative there. If you're doing memoir writing, we did a session on this earlier. You can kind of start with, planning, journaling. Yeah, check that one out. For fiction world building, you'll want to sort of set the stage, figure out who your characters are, figure out your world. Is this going to be a series? For poetry and short stories, you might end up, which is what happened with this one, with Respirator, where you have a collection of poetry or a collection of short stories or both. And you're like, I want to put out this collection. I don't really care if someone, wants to put a big name publisher behind it. I still want to put out the collection. So then once you kind of figured out what you're writing and you're in the process of, fleshing it out and you're like, okay, I want to put it out into the world. There's a couple different routes you can take. So you could self-publish it. You could find a publisher who's more DIY, which is often sort of a more approachable option, or you could really look into the publishing route of like finding an agent and having the agent shop it around and getting an advance, and that kind of thing still exists. It is still a thing. I'm sure most of you know it's less so now. That used to be the only way to do it. And so there's pros and cons. Obviously, it used to be a very few people managed to get their books published. Those who did were usually cis white men with money, with a few exceptions. It was just more difficult to make that happen, but you were sort of promised money because you started off with an advance, and then you would usually make way more than that in sales. Think like Stephen King or someone who's a millionaire from books. And today, it's much, much more possible for anyone of any sort of intersectionality and walk of life to publish. However, it's also much more likely that you're not going to get rich from doing so. So that's kind of the distinction. And I know some people who have gone the route of, shopping stuff around, trying to find an agent, trying to find a bigger publisher, and that could definitely, that's not something I know a ton about. That could be a whole different session, but that's definitely a cool option. But this is more for if you decide you either want to self-publish it, do it all you, or if you decide that you want to find a more sort of indie publisher, and then you kind of end up in a situation where you're still doing a lot of the work, you're still retaining a lot of the autonomy, but you sort of have someone else who's helping you, but then you're kind of just splitting the money. So I would say if you're going to go the route of trying to find and pitch DIY publishers, Kind of first consider the benefits versus the drawbacks. I would say if the choice is between publishing yourself and finding a DIY publisher, benefits are having someone there to help you, having someone else to promote it, having that backing. I always get kind of grossed out by the whole concept of like having a publisher name on it. Like it's only legit if it's published by someone. But it is cool to be able to point to like, oh, this came out on this, with this book publisher. And at that level, it's a lot more like a DIY record deal where you're going to get support, but you're not necessarily going to get, a ton more money because you did it that way. So definitely I would say all the benefits are kind of the added exposure, the added community. With Spaceboy books, the DIY publisher that I went through, there's a great sense of community. The editor and publisher is great. They prioritize works by women, people of color, queer people. And so there's a lot of other really cool people who have their book done through Spaceboy. So then there's this kind of cool community where we can support each other. The drawbacks then are you're not doing it all yourself. Like no longer are you doing it all you. So you're sharing a little bit of the profits, you're sharing a little bit of the money you make, and you are doing that, but you still don't have like the kind of overhead you would have if you went with a huge publisher who handed you a big advance and then told you, and after that there's more money coming. Like you're still not necessarily going to make it huge. So I would honestly say I don't think that one is better than the other. I think what matters is what you think is best for that project. So like with Wicked Woman, which I did totally by myself, I had some community help, but I just wanted to put it out myself. It was very personal to me. I was like, I'm doing this. But with Respirator, I was nervous about breaking into the science fiction community. I felt like I needed support to do that. And then I just found a place that was a great fit, even though they're very DIY. It was just a great community fit. So I was like, this makes sense for that one. And then in terms of looking for that correct DIY publisher, I think the biggest thing is just researching. Obviously that's much easier today with the internet than it was back in the day, but just looking for different places. I looked for so many different places for Respirator, and it's just like not finding what I was looking for, especially with science fiction. I was finding a lot that were like harder sci-fi, really kind of like really technical, like sciencey, and I was like, well, that's not, this is like more of like an introspective, intersectional collection, if you will. So like I would rather not have it go that route, and I don't think those people would necessarily pick it up. And then I was finding like more indie DIY kind of publishers that seem super queer, super femme. And then there's kind of this existing prejudice against science fiction with a lot of more literary types where it's like science fiction is kind of, it's just nerdy and it doesn't have that much substance or literature or whatever. So I wasn't finding a fit. And then I finally found Spaceboy because my friend, who actually is the cover illustrator, cool enough, was posting about them. And I was like, whoa, this is like specifically for like telling intersectional stories, telling stories with a little more substance, a little more literary, if you will. But for science fiction, that's exactly what I've been looking for. And I hit them up, and then almost right away they're like, yeah, we want to publish this book. And I was like, whoa, that has never happened to me. I've reached out to so many people and not even got like a few rejections, mostly just radio silence, totally ignored. So I was like, this is great. So I think a lot of it is just looking and looking and reaching out and looking and reaching out, and building those relationships. Even if you're working on a book, it's always a good idea to kind of reach out and see who maybe would be interested in that, start some casual conversations. Because I've actually started doing that with a book I hope to write, which is about the queer history of heavy metal. And for that one, I'm hopefully going to be talking to a slightly bigger publisher, but still underground, so then maybe I'll have more information on what it looks like if you go a slightly bigger route, because I do think there's, levels between like HarperCollins and Spaceboy. There's like less DIY going all the way up to the big people. So it's really just finding the right fit and building that relationship. And then once you get the book put out by them, like I said, it's kind of gonna depend what it looks like based on what kind of platform they have. In the case of Spaceboy, it's almost like self-publishing, except they advertise it everywhere. They have it on their page too. They push it. They do a bunch of posts about it, basically free advertising. They can help you set up events. If I order the books, it's through them, but I still pay, and they're still ordered like print on demand, essentially through Amazon's print on demand feature, and then they put them out for sale, and they send you a part of the proceeds. So essentially, it's still a really good situation, and I wouldn't say, especially with something this DIY, like for the cover, usually they design the cover, so then I asked them if we could use this illustration that was already done for one of the short stories by Lonnie Allen, and they were like, yeah, sure, of course. And then they showed me every step of the way, the mock-up. I think I had some feedback about like the logo or something, and they really let me be involved in that process. And this one's in bad shape. This is like my example copy, but it came out really gorgeous. They put all the quotes on the back, and they have their little logo, and then they put the cover on. So I would say the more DIY, the more control you'll have over what happens, but the less financial backing you'll have. Like, you'll probably be ordering your own copies of the book, and then just a joint effort between you and the publisher promoting it out there in a very DIY style.
What sort of, for the DIY publishers, what capacity do they typically have for promotion?
I would say that usually it would be a situation where this is just one of their side hustle jobs. I know my publisher has like a day job, and that's not uncommon with these more DIY situations, but he specifically, Nate Ragolia, my publisher through Spaceboy, always goes out of his way to like promote it. He posts about it all the time. Anytime I tell him, like I told him I was doing this event, and then he started posting about this. So really I think it's finding that person who cares. Like, he always likes to say, you know, how much he cares about the book and how much he believes in the project. So he really goes out of his way to share it as much as possible. Whereas, you know, if it wasn't quite the right fit, maybe they're like, hey, our deal is that we'll share it twice a month or something. And it's like, that's great. But then it's like such a set in stone thing. I like the fact that pretty much anytime I hit up Spaceboy, I'm like, hey, I have a thing, and they're like, oh my gosh, I'll share it everywhere. So you kind of want that relationship where they're really down to support you, like whatever that looks like, even if they can't support you with a huge $1,000 event advance, or like just, you know, buying all these books for you to sell or whatever. They need to at least be supportive in that sense. So that's kind of what if you find a DIY publisher, that process will probably look like going back and forth with that publisher. Another big benefit is that you'll have an editor in that publisher. Like, you won't have to worry about finding someone to edit it for you. You may go back and forth on some changes or lack thereof. You may go back and forth on like the design, but you'll work with them. It'll be a collaborative process. And then once it's out in the world, it'll be a collaborative process promoting it. Versus if you do decide to just completely self-publish, which is another option. So if you completely self-publish, I think a really good thing to look at is just kind of your bandwidth and what your plan is to make this happen. Like in my case, I'm not a photographer, so I got someone's photo to be on the book. I'm not a graphic designer, so I had a graphic designer. It was actually the photographer and graphic designer from my college magazine that I worked at, made this logo and made this cover. They made the back cover. I think it turned out awesome, but then it's kind of a similar collaborative process. And then just keeping in mind, you know, what monetary payment people want for doing that work for you, essentially. So, you know, working out whether it's okay for these people to do some work for you with the promise that they're going to get paid back when you start making sales. Or are you going to give them a percentage of all your sales every time you make sales? Or are you going to, you know, just pay them up front just to make sure that that's done? Like, you kind of have to like figure out paying all these people yourself. You're essentially going into publishing, even if it's just going into publishing your own book. So you're like, okay, I have to have someone to make the cover. I have to have someone to design it. You're going to want to work with an editor. I would say, you know, regardless if you yourself are an editor and a really proficient writer, you always want someone else to catch things that you might not catch, to tweak it. In this case, on this book, I'm not ashamed to say I worked with my mom. She was awesome. She's actually a writer and editor too. So something like that is totally legit. But obviously, if it's not your mom, you'll probably want to pay them. So just figuring out, you know, what that looks like and when that can happen. And in our case too, we went back and forth a lot. She helped with research too. because I'm not a super strong researcher. It's like my least favorite part of the process. And then she helped with the editing itself. So really just thinking about what your strengths and weaknesses are and kind of what connections you have. Like I was lucky enough to have my mom to help me and to know that I had all these friends who were graphic designers and did all this cool stuff, so I could ask them and pay them to do this. But you'll really want to think about, is this the kind of thing I can just totally do myself? And if it is, awesome. I know some people who they've designed the cover, they've done the art, I would still suggest having an editor, but you're self-publishing, so it's really whatever you want. And so yeah, that's kind of another option you can go. I would say then, if you look at the two books, I don't think you can necessarily tell like one is through a DIY publisher and one is self-published. I think they both look pretty professional, but you can also tell they're kind of DIY. They don't look like they were put out by HarperCollins or whatever. So that one good thing about Amazon or whatever it is the standardization of like it's going to be printed like on decent quality paper with decent cover, but really just getting those details down. And then I would say another thing is once the book comes out, if you're self-publishing, then you're like totally on your own in terms of promotion. And so in my case, I made a Facebook page, I decked that out, I started sharing through that. I just did that through social media. I paid for a few Facebook ads. I realized that if you pay for a Facebook ad on something like this, you get a lot of trolls commenting and like saying nasty stuff, but then that also gives it a lot of engagement, and so all of a sudden people were seeing it. So it's kind of just like figuring out your own strategies. I asked like the magazines I work for, like, hey, can I put an ad on just online or whatever, since I run the online ads anyway, and they were like, sure. So it's really the connections you have and kind of how you can utilize those. But it is a big project because, again, you're essentially going into publishing for yourself. So you're doing DIY advertising, DIY everything, promoting your own book, trying to figure out, should I buy any advertisement? Should I do a paid Facebook post? Should I just try to do this all organic and grassroots? And then anytime you want to have like a book signing event or be at an event like this or something, you're advocating for yourself. So you yourself would reach out to the center and be like, hey, I'm a queer author, I want to be at this event. You wouldn't have, a publicist or a publisher or an editor reaching out on your behalf. So I'd say that's really the difference on that DIY level, is how much support do you think you need? And I think a lot of times if you just aren't finding that right fit, you're like, because in the case with Wicked Woman, I was reaching out to some publishers who have done music books, and they're like, oh yeah, I'm really interested. In 10 years, we could put it out. And at the time, I was like just done with college. I was like, that feels like a lifetime away. I'm definitely not waiting. So I just like jumped in. But then with Respirator, I was like, okay, I'm a little older. I'm a little more patient. The fact that you say it's going to take a year for this to come out, that's more reasonable. But with some of these even small, bigger publishers, it can be a really long waiting list. They're like, yeah, we're interested. Just know it'll be a couple years. And so then it's also wondering, if you want to wait that amount of time or not. Because for something like this, the information would totally change. In 10 years, I might as well, like already all this is so dated in that I could already write a new book with what's happened since then. So it's like that amount of time doesn't make sense to me. But yeah, it's really just kind of that determination. And then I actually just got these zines from the folks outside. We traded a book for their zines, which is great. And I wasn't really planning on going into that side of like DIY publishing. But obviously this is another option. I did a zine for my project in college. I did like a poetry miscellany. I was living in Richmond, Virginia at the time. So I basically gathered poetry from like starting with like the indigenous folks that had lived in Virginia before they were even colonizers, all the way up through like colonial times, 1800s, 1900s, Edgar Allan Poe, all the way through like modern day, like bands, lyrics and stuff. So doing a zine is a lot of work. It can be a really fun project though. It can be as simple as this one, which is brilliant, but really I feel like, maybe they did just take a few days. They cut things out, they glued things in, they wrote things, it's kind of artsy. Or something like this that takes a little more effort, where they got it photocopied, color copied. They did there's these like intricate like collages on every page, and writing, it's like a story. They did like the cut and paste. So there's a lot of options, not necessarily a lot of opportunity for like a whole ton of pay, but it can be a really fun, easy way if you're like, I just have a story to tell, I want to make a magazine, I want to put that out in the world, I think that's great, and you know, you can do it pretty easily and just do it yourself in this manner. And that's also really good practice, you know. You could literally just make a zine like this and be like, okay, I'm going to start with the idea, I'm going to make this, I'm going to publish it, I'm going to print, you know, 150 and I'm going to sell them for $2, and I'm just going to see how that goes. Like, I'm going to see what that's like before I take on like a book project or something. So that can be really good practice too. But yeah, in a nutshell, I would say the biggest things about self-publishing, DIY self-publishing, is just know that you're gonna do a lot of work, but it'll be rewarding, and it'll be really cool, even, you know, whether you do it all yourself and pull in community members around you to help you, or if you find a cool publisher, it'll be really rewarding. And then I think the last thing that I think is important to point out is, I know a lot of DIY self-publishing goes through Amazon. It's kind of like this horrible situation that we're all stuck in, where Amazon sort of has a monopoly on the print on demand. And then there's just this sort of situation where you have like a lot of smaller booksellers who are like down with Amazon, and I totally understand their frustrations with Amazon. But then there's also this problem with some of these indie booksellers where they're a little snobby and they only want books that have a publisher behind it, and not even necessarily this kind of publisher, like a bigger publisher. So then you just sort of run into this ethical dilemma of like, okay, because I don't have like a master's and I didn't publish with this big publisher, I'm not welcome in these spaces, but then you're saying Amazon's bad, and so then you're kind of stuck like, what do I do? So honestly, I can't solve that crisis right now. I don't know what we can do, but I will say you can get my books through Barnes & Noble. If you're not comfortable with Amazon, then I think it might still be printed the same way, but it's then sold through Barnes & Noble, which I know is still a big corporation, but then you're like avoiding the whole Amazon thing. Or you can support DIY authors by, I always order a whole bunch in bulk, and then Amazon or whatever it is only getting just the amount of money that it costs to print. They're not getting the extra profits. So you can buy directly from the DIY authors. That's why I always try to order a lot. And then you're giving the profits directly to that author, instead of, okay, we'll split it with the publisher, author, and Amazon, or we'll split it with the author and Amazon. So if you're like, Amazon's icky and I'm absolutely boycotting it, I'm not buying anything that way, just know you can still support indie authors. You can usually reach out to them and be like, hey, I don't feel good about buying from Amazon, and I saw that's where your book is. Do you ever order a whole bunch in bulk that you could just send me? Is there another way to get them, or something? I just think it's important to plug, like, not punishing small authors because they kind of have to use that platform, and I'm hoping we get some more options soon. But
I think it's really important to recognize that many of us are limited in access, right?
Yes.
And that is what so much of what you're talking about with the initial publishing industry. So much of it was based around folks with money, with power, being able to share their voices, and likewise, it may not be the best situation for everybody involved, but at least with something like Amazon, it makes it a little more accessible.
right, at least it's accessible, and hopefully with all of the work that's happening with like strikes and people having new ideas, hopefully there will be alternatives soon. But
So one of the things you mentioned in terms of an advantage with a larger publishing organization was the possibility of sort of community, or being able to connect with other writers under that publisher. For writers who are looking at a DIY or self-publishing path, are there communities that you might recommend for them?
Let's see. I would say, I mean, it so differs and depends on your niche, kind of. For queer writers, I know there's those resources that I read off in the last group that through
Lighthouse Books,
they
yeah.
have a lot of really good ones, and I think connecting with people like that through something like that can be really helpful for not just like feedback on your writing, but also tips as far as getting published. But I would say the best advice is just to kind of look into whatever that specific niche is. So for me, it was like, okay, music writing, but with like a bigger agenda, talking about social issues. and a certain kind of music, and then science fiction, but more literary, but not snobby. So I kind of just kept digging around until I found those niches. So I would say just try and find those people, and then don't be afraid to reach out. Like, just don't have that imposter syndrome of like, well, they're all probably already published, and you know, who am I? Like, just reach out. The worst that can happen is they ignore you or say something kind of shitty and you block them. So like, just try, just reach out.
What was something like a big surprise or something that was unexpected in your journeys around publishing?
I would say it was all kind of unexpected. I really did not know that I would receive as much success as I did. I think when I put out Wicked Woman, I was still super young because I was literally like 23, 24 when it first got out there. And so it was really surprising to see all the interest I got. I got added to a bunch of groups for women metal writers. It helped jumpstart my career in writing about extreme music through like a feminist and queer lens, and it landed me the job I have today with New Noise and all the other writing jobs I've had. I got invited to a conference out in San Francisco that was like an academic metal conference that they even paid for part of me going, and I was like, this is crazy. Like, I did not think any of this was going to happen. And then I think the most surprising thing with Respirator was sending it to Spaceboy and just immediately having them be like, yes, we want to publish this. Because I did not expect, I expected maybe, oh yeah, this is really cool, like we like it, but we'll see maybe later. And they were just like, yeah, let's do it right now. So I think that also just goes to like my philosophy of like, just do it. Just put it out there, or just put yourself out there and ask someone. I know that's way easier said than done, but like the reward can be really awesome. Even if you send it to 50 publishers and one publisher is like, yes, absolutely, and all the other ones just totally ignore you, like it's still a good feeling to get accepted.
So one of the things you mentioned about, and I'm just going to kind of phrase it like this, is essentially troll attention that
Yes.
occurred during when you put it out there.
Mm-hmm.
And having been a vast consumer of YouTube videos and all of that myself, one of the things that oftentimes gets mentioned is
Mm-hmm.
like, this is still engagement,
Yeah.
right? It still drives people
Yeah.
to engage and may actually wind up helping visibility. But
Mm-hmm.
how do you process that? How do you navigate that, especially
Yeah.
with your identities,
Yeah.
right? How do you navigate that? What are some of the best practices that you use to take care of yourself?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, especially with Outfront too. I mean, almost anytime we like boost something, so it's not just going to our audience, it's like going to the whole metro area and the whole country or whatever, we get some troll attention. We had some really nasty, like, anti-trans turf people saying some really crappy stuff about one of our events one year, and like, we've gotten a lot of that. And then with Wicked Woman, it just always seems to be like these, like, one man will just be like, yeah, the women are just groupies or something, and then like everyone will go in and attack them. Honestly, I pick and choose my battles. I have this conversation a lot with Outfront social media manager, because he's more of the opinion of like, even if it's like, a big fight, let it happen, because then that helps our engagement. And I'm like, yes, but my first priority is always the safety of our community. So I would say if someone makes a post and you just really don't feel comfortable with it, like if they make a post that says, something transphobic or something homophobic or something racist, like, just take it down. Sometimes people will be like, well, then you took my post down, and so you're not even listening to both sides. I'm like, no, if it's hateful, I'm just gonna take it down. Like, if you're actually arguing both sides, like, hey, I love Outfront, but I didn't see this kind of representation, that's valid.
That's
if
a
you're
very
just on
different
there,
thing.
yeah, to say like, why I hate all gays, then I'm like, okay, deleted, like, not even worth it. In the case of the boosted ads, I felt like it was divorced from who I personally am. Yes, it's me, but it's my book. And then like one person would make a comment and so many people would go defending the book that I was like, okay, this is cool. But if it was a whole thread of just guys saying awful things, then I would delete it. Another thing that happens sometimes that I just want to mention because it's hilarious is sometimes people like hit on the book. Like, they'll message the book page and be like, hey girl, what you doing? And I'm like, this is a book page with 3 different women on the cover, none of whom are me. Do you want to buy a book? And then they just stop responding. But, like, I'm surprised no one's hit on this one yet, because there's also, like, a sexy lady. Like, hey girl. I'm like, that's an illustration. Like, so if you put stuff on the internet, just know that, like, people are bizarre. I don't know if it's bots or if it's just really clueless men, but whatever it is, it's probably both. Just know that, like, yeah, weird attention happens. I would say take care of yourself first. If you don't like it, don't engage, delete it, step away. You don't have to engage with anything like that for just the engagement, but if you feel like it's helping you and it's something that you're comfortable with and you're like, yeah, someone made a shitty comment, but everyone jumped in, you know, defending me and it went well, like, cool, then
That has to be
feel
really
empowered
good to
leave
see
it.
when you
Yes.
see community members step up and say, no, there's been
Yeah.
a lot of women engaged in heavy metal in this music scene,
Yes.
and yeah.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions from our in-person audience? Realize that we are also broadcasting on the internet, so I think everybody's being quiet.
Well, I also wanted to say I'll give the in-person people my card, but if you're listening in, you can email me anytime. I have a million emails, but you can just do Addison@outfrontmagazine.com, ADDISON @outfrontmagazine.com, or if you search me, I'm sure you'll find trolls and also me. But yeah, just feel free to reach out if you have any questions. If you're just like, hey, I love this, but I want to do it myself, or I need more support, or, you know, how did you do this or that, feel free to reach out.
Great. Thank you so much, Addison.
Yeah.
And remember, folks,
Thank
if you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe to our channel, check out our website, lgbtqcolorado.org, and have a happy Pride.
Yeah, happy Pride.